in der Minorität bleiben, weil wir die wertvollsten Elemente des Kampfes und des Opfers sind.
Totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die
It was 6 in the morning in Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich, or any average city of the Reich. The alarm clock rang in rental apartments where the smell of dampness and coal permeated the walls. The cast-iron heaters took 20 minutes to warm up a small room. In winter, breath condensed in the air as men shaved with cold water over porcelain sinks. But the year was 1933, and something had changed that had nothing to do with the temperature. In January 1930, 6 million Germans were unemployed. The average wage had dropped by 33% in 3 years. It is estimated that at the worst moments of the Great Depression, up to a third of the country's workforce was unemployed. Men stood in line in front of employment offices before dawn. Women stretched food to the limit. Children arrived at school without having breakfast, with shoes worn down to the sole, and teachers had learned not to ask. Men returning from work in late 1932 and early 1933 found that their wives, on their own initiative, had gone to buy them party uniforms, hoping that affiliation would guarantee them some protection or even a job. Some joined the NSDAP to avoid the worst. A few did so convinced. The majority joined, carried by the tide. The key to that transformation was a single word: work. In 1934, the unemployment figures, which had reached 6 million in 1932, had dropped by half. By 1936, the employment level was approaching that of the prosperous year of 1928. In 1937 and 1938, the demand for labor exceeded the supply by 500,000 people. For a worker who had been unemployed for 4 years, this was not propaganda. It was bread on the table. The regime knew how to take advantage of this moment with brutal skill. On National Labor Day, May 1, 1933, millions of workers were led to the stadiums with flags and music, while assault groups from the SA simultaneously seized union offices throughout Germany. The next day, the unions ceased to exist. Workers had jobs, but they had lost the ability to negotiate their conditions. Instead, the German Labour Front, led by Robert Ley, took control of labor relations throughout the Reich. Robert Ley was a singular figure, a chemistry graduate, a chronic alcoholic, popularly known as the Chief National Drunk, and endowed with inexhaustible demagogic rhetoric. On one memorable occasion, he told workers at a factory that a scientist considers himself lucky if in his whole life he stumbles upon a germ, while a street sweeper picks up thousands of them with every sweep of his broom. Ley defined socialism as the relationship of men in the trenches. It was absurd. It was effective. Under his leadership, the Labour Front was not a union. It was a chain of control disguised as social benefit. Workers paid mandatory dues that amounted to approximately 18% of their gross salary, including contributions to the front, taxes, and insurance. But in return, they received something that the Weimar unions had never been able to offer on a large scale: paid vacations, organized excursions, cruises to the Norwegian fjords. Strength Through Joy, the Labour Front's super agency for leisure, was the largest mass tourism organization in Western Europe in the second half of the 1930s. In 1938, 180,000 Germans took part in organized cruises, and 10 million, 3/5 of them workers, took some type of vacation trip under its auspices. A week in the Harz Mountains cost 28 marks, a fortnight at Lake Constance 65 marks, a trip to Italy 155 marks. For a skilled worker in the metal sector earning between 27 and 100 marks per week, this was for the first time accessible in their life. Thus began the morning in the Third Reich, with the feeling, for many, that something was finally working. At 7 in the morning, the citizen of the Third Reich would go out into the street, and from that very first moment, their body was no longer entirely their own. The German salute, the arm extended horizontally with the palm facing down while saying Heil Hitler, was technically mandatory for public officials, all party members, and in an increasing number of social situations. But in practice, the pressure was universal. Failing to salute at the right moment in front of the wrong person could become a reason for denunciation. Richard Grunberger documented the phenomenon accurately. People who wanted to stay out of the salute had developed what was popularly called the German look, a furtive rotation of the head and eyes by which they made sure there were no spies before discussing any confidential matter. The Nazi salute caused a kind of Pavlovian conditioning in many. Housewives dreamed that a member of the SA was visiting them in their sleep. People opposed to the regime had nightmares in which they were already saluting before consciously deciding to do so. German railway officials working on the tracks were at some point given a specific order. They had to replace the raised arm salute with the military salute because the extended arm had been mistaken for railway signals several times, causing accidents. In factories, the workday began with a specific ritual. In a company in Württemberg, 2 workers played a song on the harmonica every morning to open the day's tasks. In a company in Magdeburg, bells marked the mid-morning and lunch breaks. Clocking in to start and finish the day was replaced in many workplaces by an attendance list. A local leader of the German Labour Front justified these innovations by declaring that creative work was the greatest blessing the Germans enjoyed. The factory canteens had also been transformed. According to reports from the SD, the SS's domestic intelligence service, they were filled with enthusiasm when Hitler spoke on the radio during working hours. Beethoven's music played in the background of the broadcasted speeches. Goebbels had understood something fundamental. Radio was the most effective tool for domestic penetration ever invented. In 1933, Germany had approximately 4 million radio sets. By 1939, it had over 16 million. The Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, designed specifically to be cheap and with limited range to German stations, cost 35 marks and became the most widespread object in the homes of the Reich. In bakeries, which had to remain open from 6 in the morning until 7 or 8 in the evening, the workers developed a custom that became everyday folklore. When a customer asked for a scarce item, the shopkeeper could refuse the sale or make the purchase conditional on buying another product. The popularization of this practice gave rise to the phrase, Der deutsche Gruß ist Pflaumenmus. The German salute is plum jam. It meant that the mandatory Heil Hitler ritual upon entering shops was as inseparable from everyday experience as the jam they made you buy when you only wanted butter. The freezing of wages at depression levels was the official policy. Between 1934 and 1937, weekly earnings increased by 15%, but this average concealed wide differences. Metal and construction workers could reach 100 marks per week with overtime. Female workers in the textile sector earned 51 pfennigs per hour, compared to 78 for men in the same categories. Women earned a third less than men in equivalent jobs, a gap that was not only tolerated but structurally protected by the regime. For civil servants, the morning routine had additional layers of obligation. Since 1939, party membership had become practically a requirement for entering the civil service. Every state employee was obliged to subscribe to the party newspapers and find new readers for them. The Supreme Administrative Court of Prussia even supported the dismissal of a civil servant based on the fact that, as a non-regular reader of the party newspapers, he only knew by hearsay the National Socialist State's position on the Jewish question. A married postman who had been childless for several years could receive at any moment a visit from a party official with an ultimatum. Mein Herr, you receive money from the state and must serve the interests of the state. I give you 1 year to conceive a child or adopt one. Such was the morning. At 8:30 in the morning, children entered the schools of the Third Reich. They were schools recognizable from the outside. The same brick facades, the same wooden desks, the same blackboards. But inside, the curriculum had undergone such a complete transformation that a teacher from 1928 would not have recognized what was being taught in 1936 in the same building. What was notable, however, is that this transformation was not entirely abrupt. Nazism found already prepared ground. In 1931, Jewish newspapers published lists of schools where children were less exposed to anti-Semitism, so parents could transfer them there. Before 1933, school children all over Germany had renamed the game of cowboys and Indians, calling it Aryans and Jews. The education system of the Weimar Republic, in many of its teachers, was an incubator for nationalism before the Nazis came to power. The Nazi leaders saw this clearly and took advantage of it. After taking power, few teachers were dismissed, and among the non-Jews who were dismissed, some were reinstated during the subsequent shortage of teachers. A notable proportion of the existing textbooks continued to be used for the time being. The apparent continuity had the dual advantage of preserving the existing organization and giving confidence to the conservative opinion. The most visible and drastic change in the early years was not in the content but in the bodies. In January 1934, a law against excessive attendance at schools and universities froze the female proportion in university enrollment at 10%, reducing overall enrollment until, by the time the war broke out, it had dropped by almost 3/5 compared to 1933. Biology was the core of the new educational system. Racial doctrine occupied the center of natural science classes, but also of history, geography, and physical education. Textbooks presented students with racial classification tables, skulls of different human groups with their respective measurements, family trees illustrating the inheritance of desirable and undesirable physical characteristics. Students learned to measure their skulls and classify each other according to racial types. One aspect of grotesque incongruity in this pedagogy was the simultaneous taboo on sexual education. Mendel's laws of inheritance were obsessively taught, but it was declared that sexual education was not the concern of either the school or the Hitler Youth. The substitution was a 10-point sheet that 14-year-olds received upon leaving school with eugenic advice. Health is a prerequisite for external beauty. Do not choose a playmate, but a comrade for marriage. Wish for as many children as possible. In history classrooms, the Great War was taught as a betrayal. The myth of the stab in the back, according to which the undefeated German army had been defeated not on the battlefield but by socialist politicians, Jews, and defeatists in the rear, was presented as a historical fact. And the new reading material for younger age groups eliminated fairy tales and animal stories to replace them with the epic of the Great War and the Hitler Youth. A paragraph from a book titled The Mutiny of the Fleets of 1918, aimed at children aged 10 to 12, said, "The monstrosity advances, its breath foul, roaring, eager, possessed, shameless and unmarshalled, timid and cowardly, careless and arrogant, the mutineers rise. They spit at the officers who stand there with iron faces." The Battle of Tannenberg, intended for 14-year-olds, included this description of combat. A Russian soldier tried to block the infiltrators' way, but Otto's bayonet sank with a crack between the Russian's ribs and he collapsed moaning. There, before him, simple and bright, was the object of his dreams, the Iron Cross. Mathematics retained its classical structure, but the problems were rewritten. Artillery trajectories replaced crossing trains, ratios between fighters and bombers replaced mixture problems, and budget deficits due to democratic indulgence toward hereditarily sick families served as the context for percentage exercises. The conditioning was subliminal, continuous, and cumulative. Sport was the most visible and everyday instrument of transformation. The usual number of physical education sessions per week was increased from 2 to 3 in 1936 and, at the expense of religious classes, to 5 in 1938. Boxing became mandatory in higher schools. Poor performance in physical education could be grounds for expulsion and prohibition from further studies. It was seriously proposed that the physical education instructor at each school be automatically appointed as deputy headmaster. It was the reports from the sports teacher, not the language or history teacher, that informed parents about their child's character development. The physical effects of this pressure on the children's bodies were measurable. 37% of the boys recruited in 1936 had flat feet, a direct result of the marches and exercises of the Hitler Youth. A doctor from Hanover reported in 1937 that orthopedic symptoms, previously seen only in apprentices and adolescents, were beginning to appear in school-aged children. The nervousness of children and adolescents was the subject of numerous comments from doctors, both German and foreign. Delegates from the British Ministry of Education who visited Germany in 1937 observed that German youth is subjected to strong nervous tension. We were impressed by the harshness and seriousness of the young people's expressions in schools and in the Hitler Youth. Denunciation was a constant professional risk for teachers. Low grades or adverse comments on essays copied word for word from articles published in the Nazi press could be taken as a sign of political opposition. In secondary schools, female students in the 6th grade even reported classmates to the Gestapo to improve their position in the competition for limited university places. However, 97% of teachers were enrolled in the National Socialist Teachers League, and by 1936, 32% of all its members belonged to the Nazi Party, a proportion almost twice as high as that of the civil service. 2/3 of teachers had attended one-month ideological training camps before 1938. The joke circulated with precision: what is the shortest measurable unit of time, the time it takes for a school teacher to change his jacket? In the classrooms, two incompatible hierarchies coexisted, the academic one based on education and knowledge, and the political one based on the intensity of ideological commitment. Teachers had to exercise great tact in their dealings with the leaders of the Hitler Youth, students in uniform who held authority outside the classrooms and resisted subordinating themselves within them. In Pomerania, specially appointed teachers had to conduct intensive courses so that the leaders of the youth who were behind could catch up to their peers. Baldur von Schirach, who led the youth organization, publicly compared school teachers, pedantic and stupid, with the brilliantly inspired youth marching toward the new dawn. The effect on the quality of teaching was measurable. In 1940, the SD reported a general decline in the level of students, especially in elementary and vocational schools, with a clear downward trend for the past 2 or 3 years. The Wehrmacht complained that many of the officer candidates show a lack of basic knowledge that is simply inconceivable. In Hamburg, a newspaper publicly asked, "Is our youth getting dumber?" In a local apprentice exam, out of 179 participants, 94 had written proper names with lowercase letters, and 81 were unable to spell Goethe's last name. For those destined for the regime's elite, there was a parallel educational system. The 39 National Politische Erziehungsanstalten, the Napoles, boarding schools that combined the standard secondary program with intensive political education, extreme physical exercises such as boxing, sailing, motorcycle riding, and fights with Alsatian dogs. The classes were called platoons. The routine imitated that of a military camp with target practice and gymnastics before breakfast, and discussions on editorials from the Völkischer Beobachter were part of the daily schedule. However, even the SS administrator who supervised the Napoles, Heismeyer, publicly acknowledged that the intellectual level of his students was not above, but rather below that of the average German secondary school. At the peak of the Nazi educational pyramid were the Ordensburgen, the castles of the order, 4 centers for the future elite of the party, located in remote landscapes of the Alps and the Prussian lakes. Students entered at around the age of 25 after having passed through an Adolf Hitler school, the Labor Service, and the Wehrmacht. The dining hall of the Ordensburg in Sonthofen was 192 meters long, with German marble walls and floors, seating for 1,500 people, and its Ordenssaal hosted neo-pagan ceremonies. Robert Ley, its main promoter, claimed that no candidate was asked if they had a law degree, but rather, what kind of person are you? Selection did not depend on exams, but on the support the candidate had within the party hierarchy of their district. Such was the school of the Reich, a system that degraded knowledge by principle, that measured the value of a child by their legs and feet rather than by their mind, that gave a dagger to a 14-year-old and killed them at 15 with a real bullet in Warsaw or on the Volga. At 10 in the morning, in any neighborhood of the Reich, there was someone whose specific function was surveillance. It was the Blockwart, the block leader. Their mission was to keep all the residents of a block of houses under the strictest surveillance and present them with the party's collection boxes at every possible opportunity. In all buildings divided into apartments or rooms, the block leaders were in charge of the party notice boards, which displayed, in addition to propaganda exhortations, announcements on a variety of topics. The address of the nearest information office, details about upcoming collections, civil defense drills, changes in the social security or rationing system. Through local government delegations, block leaders had access to the confidential files of tax collection offices and other agencies. This meant they could complete their personal information on every resident. They knew if someone had debts. They knew if someone didn't vote in the plebiscites. And in the system of denunciation that supported the scaffolding of the Third Reich, that information was power. The NSDAP had, before coming to power, 850,000 members out of a population of 66 million. At the height of the Third Reich, the number rose to 8 million out of the 80 million inhabitants of Greater Germany. 1 in every 4 adult Germans was a party member. But that quantitative fact, though important, was less significant than the structural penetration of the party in all areas of life. The party was divided into 3 mutually exclusive groups: administrators, propagandists, and shock troops. The administrators mostly came from small towns and rural areas with basic education. The propagandists tended to be more bourgeois, with more university education. The shock troops, members of the SA and SS, were the least educated and from the lowest social origins. Of the 30 Gauleiter, the regional party leaders, virtually omnipotent in their territories, 23 had received only elementary education. 6 were school teachers, 3 were manual workers. Only 3 of the 30 had graduated from university. This party aristocracy was the great social revolutionary of the Third Reich, men of humble or middle origins who, thanks to their seniority in the movement, had gained access to positions of power that the previous system would have denied them. The old fighters, those who joined before September 1930, made up the internal elite. Those who joined between 1930 and 1932 formed the middle layer. And those who joined after March 1933, when Hitler was already Chancellor, were given the mocking nickname March Violets, those who bloomed when there was no longer any risk in doing so. The joke circulated: if the Führer had joined the party later, he would have gone further. The relationship between the party and the state created constant friction, which citizens experienced in their daily lives. Nazi mayors could be simultaneously local party leaders and municipal officials. In 1935, it was estimated that party members occupied 3/5 of more than 52,000 executive positions in state and local government bodies. This meant that renewing a document, paying a tax, or filing a complaint likely involved dealing with someone whose primary loyalty was to the party, not to the law. The lower ranks of the party, the block leaders, local section chiefs, were considered intrusive and bothersome even within the Nazi apparatus itself. But their surveillance role was essential to the system. They were the eyes and ears of the regime in every staircase, in every courtyard, in every building lobby. A Nazi newspaper even published the names and addresses of women who appeared in the erotic diary of a Jewish man from Frankfurt. The declared aim was public shame. The result was, among other things, a demonstration that the privacy of any citizen could be exposed and destroyed with the party's machinery as the instrument. Work structured the day of the citizen of the Reich like no other European state at the time. Not because the Germans worked more than others, although they eventually would, but because the regime had turned work into an ideological and moral category in addition to an economic one. The motto inscribed at the entrance of the Auschwitz concentration camp, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, was the perverted version of a concept that ran through the entire labor culture of the Reich. But before that motto became an obscene mockery, it functioned for years as a genuine principle in the minds of millions of workers who had seen the misery of unemployment and found in economic recovery a reason for loyalty to the regime. The workday in the years of peace ranged between 40 and 50 hours a week in most sectors, but key industries, metal, construction, mining, often operated between 12 and 14 hours a day. In 1939, working hours were up to 10% longer than at any time before the Depression. For comparison, during the same period, the Popular Front government in France and Mussolini's government in Italy had reduced working hours. The work accident was a direct consequence of this regime. Between 1933 and 1939, while the industrial workforce increased by approximately 50%, from 13.5 million to 20.8 million workers. The number of work-related accidents and illnesses increased by 150%, from 929,000 to 2,253,000. Fatal accidents multiplied by 2.5. The number of work-related diseases tripled. Despite this, company doctors and medical staff at health insurance offices were under institutional pressure to reduce sick leave. The average duration of work absences due to illness in 1937 was 3.2 days, compared to 4.2 days in 1932. The Hermann Göring National Industries proudly boasted in 1940 that the average duration of illness among their staff was less than half that of the industry in general. In factory canteens, midday meals faithfully reproduced the social and hierarchical structure of the Reich. Directors and foremen ate separately. Blue-collar workers sat at different tables from white-collar workers. The principle of authority in industry, which the regime had imported from military ideology, established that the relationship between the company manager and their producers was analogous to that between an officer and their soldiers. The company director was called chief, even in the official documentation of the labor front. Skilled metal workers earned between 78 and 100 pfennigs per hour in 1937. Female workers in the same sector earned 51 pfennigs. An unskilled laborer could receive 50 pfennigs. A female worker in the toy industry in Thuringia earned barely 30. At the darkest extreme, Grunberger documented the case of 30 female metal workers in Silesia who earned 20 pfennigs per hour and were forced to supplement their income through prostitution. For workers in strategic industries and armaments, however, the reality was different. In certain sectors, piecework allowed base earnings to be multiplied. A skilled metal worker could earn 100 marks per week, including overtime and bonuses, at a time when the average industrial wage was 27 marks. This difference was enough to purchase a radio, pay for organized holidays, and make installments on a Volkswagen which, if all went well, might eventually arrive. The Volkswagen was, in itself, a symbolic promise of the regime. With a price of less than 1,000 marks, payable in 4 years through weekly installments of 6 marks, the people's car would have committed its buyers to dedicate between a third and a quarter of their weekly pay to the investment. Hundreds of thousands of Germans opened savings accounts linked to the plan. None ever received their car. The outbreak of the war in 1939 converted the factories to armaments, and the plan was cancelled. The money was never refunded. At the end of the workday, the deduction from the salary was a ritual of accumulated losses: 4.5% for unemployment insurance, 5 or 5.5% for health and old age insurance, 3.5% for income tax, the Labour Front fee, and the contribution to winter aid. In total, the equivalent of 18% of the gross salary disappeared before the envelope was touched. And yet, compared to 1932, it was better. That comparison was the fuel of the regime. Joseph Goebbels woke up late. He was one of the few people in the Reich whose schedule was genuinely irregular. Minister of Propaganda since March 1933, he rarely went to bed before 2 in the morning and rarely reached his office at the ministry on Wilhelmplatz before 11 in the morning. But his influence over the German noon was total. Radio was the central instrument. The people's receivers, the Volksempfänger, cost 35 marks and were calibrated to receive only German stations, making them more like loudspeakers for the regime than windows to the outside world. In 1933, Germany had approximately 4 million radio sets. By 1939, it had more than 16 million. This leap was the result of a deliberate policy. The radio was subsidized, the manufacturing of the devices was simplified to reduce costs, and listening in workplaces, bars, public dining halls, and waiting rooms was actively promoted. Beethoven's music served as background to the Führer's broadcast speeches. In factory canteens, machines would stop during important speeches. SD reports indicated that workers listened enthusiastically when Hitler spoke during working hours. But these same reports, when read carefully, also record the accumulated weariness during the war years when workers began to leave the canteens as soon as the introductory tune started playing. Listening to foreign broadcasts was progressively penalized, first with fines, then with imprisonment, and during the war, with death. A prominent Viennese dancer was sentenced to 3 years in prison for listening to foreign stations, denounced by his own teenage daughter. A Luftwaffe captain was accused of military subversion of the individual, Wehrkraftzersetzung, when his diary, in which he had expressed private doubts about Germany's ability to win the war, fell into the wrong hands during a bombing. It wasn't necessary to betray the Reich militarily. It was enough to privately doubt and for someone to find out. Cinema was Goebbels' second instrument, and in it he demonstrated a sophistication that no other totalitarian regime of his time matched. Cinema attendance had been steadily increasing throughout the 1930s. By the outbreak of the war in 1939 and into 1940, it nearly doubled. But what was relevant wasn't the number, but the content. The Ministry of Propaganda controlled every film shown in the Reich, and yet most of the German film productions of the 1930s were not explicitly political propaganda films. They were light comedies, romantic dramas, family melodramas with conventional endings. Goebbels understood something that his Soviet counterparts took longer to learn. Hard, continuous, and explicit propaganda produces immunity. The citizen who enters the cinema to watch a love comedy and finds a film about the greatness of the Reich will leave before the end. The one who enters to watch a love comedy, watches it, laughs, gets emotional, and only receives the obligatory newsreel before the main feature, those 10 minutes where the troops advance, the Führer's speech, and the harvest successes appear, leaves having consumed propaganda without consciously deciding to. However, hard propaganda had its key pieces. The Eternal Jew, released in 1940, was a pseudo-documentary that compared Jews to rats, used images of kosher slaughterhouses juxtaposed with surgical scenes to induce disgust, and concluded with a veiled call for the final solution. Leni Riefenstahl, who was never a member of the party and never signed any ideological documents but whose cinematic skill was undeniable, had filmed Triumph of the Will in 1935, documenting the 1934 Nuremberg rally with visual language that transformed the mass into living sculpture and turned Hitler into an almost supernatural figure. It was absolute propaganda, precisely because it didn't seem like it. It was, in all formal terms, a documentary. The newspapers operated under the same principle. The Schriftleitergesetz of October 1933, the editor's law, transformed journalists into state officials with legal responsibility for the content of their publications. Every day, in editorial offices throughout the Reich, bulletins from the Ministry of Propaganda arrived indicating which news should be published, with which headline and on which page. The instructions were sometimes surprisingly specific. An order from 1934 prohibited the use of the term murder to describe a specific assassination and ordered it to be replaced with treacherous attack. Another from 1936 stated that if boxer Max Schmeling lost his next fight, the news should appear on an inside page without a photograph. Hitler's diplomatic victories were presented on the front page in triumphant typeface. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, the annexation of Austria in March 1938, the incorporation of the Sudetenland in October of the same year, each one was preceded by weeks of propaganda preparation that framed it as the correction of a historical injustice. The Treaty of Versailles was the permanent horizon of Nazi narrative. Every territorial advance was presented as the redress of a legitimate grievance, not as aggression. This conceptual framework was genuinely believed by millions of Germans who had experienced the humiliation of 1919 as a personal wound. Victor Klemperer, a philologist from Dresden who survived Nazism thanks to his marriage to an Aryan woman, dedicated years to analyzing the lingua tertii imperiae, the language of the Third Reich. What he documented was a systematic transformation of the German language that operated through emptying and substitution. The words kept their external form but changed in content. Fanatisch, fanatical, ceased to be an insult and became a compliment. One was fanatisch in defending Aryan values, fanatisch in work, fanatisch in loyalty to the Führer. Weltanschauung, worldview, a philosophical term of romantic origin, was emptied of its complexity to designate only the Nazi ideology. Rasse, race, went from being a descriptive concept to a moral category. There were races that deserved to exist and races that were obstacles to humanity. The cumulative effect of living submerged in this language for years was the colonization of thought. Klemperer documented how he himself, vigilant and critical, found at certain moments that the Nazi formulations came to his mind before his own. That was precisely what Goebbels sought, not conscious conviction but unconscious conditioning, the moment when the citizen repeats the regime's formulas without realizing that they have stopped thinking in their own words. Propaganda also had its festive side. Mass spectacles, the Nuremberg rallies, National Labor Day, the party's annual days, were designed with top-tier theatrical techniques. Albert Speer, architect of the Cathedral of Light in Nuremberg, understood that the emotional experience of belonging to a crowd of 700,000 people, illuminated by 130 floodlights pointing to the night sky, was irresistible to the human nervous system, regardless of the ideological content. It was felt together. It was felt as grand. And that feeling, Goebbels knew, is more lasting than any rational argument. Domestically, propaganda penetrated homes through the radio, through posters, through calendars with the party's holy days marked in red, through postage stamps with the Führer's profile, through Christmas cards with images of the Hitler Youth in the snow. The Volksgemeinschaft, the community of the people, was a concept that Goebbels relentlessly manufactured. The idea that all Germans, rich or poor, noble or common, urban or rural, were united by a racial identity that transcended class divisions. It was false, it was effective, and it was repeated in so many formats and so constantly that the repetition itself created a sort of functional truth. The one-pot day, Eintopfsonntag, is a minor but revealing example of how this propaganda operated on a domestic level. Once a month, Germans were urged to eat only a simple stew on Sunday and donate the difference between that cost and that of a normal meal to Winter Aid. Party officials and Blockwart would go around collecting the contributions. Photos in the newspapers showed Hitler and Reich ministers eating their one-pot meal alongside shipyard workers. The message was not only economic, it was symbolic. It asked you to physically embody with your own body your belonging to the community, to feel the identity with the worker, with the soldier, with the Führer, through the act of eating the same thing. Meanwhile, the Minister of Propaganda dined in his luxurious residence with guests that included movie stars with generous décolletage, listening to jazz melodies played by an orchestra at the Kameradschaftsclub of the German artists in Skagerrak Square in Berlin. That was also the midday of the Reich. Goebbels eating well while the citizen ate their one-pot meal, convinced that doing so made them more German. At 3 in the afternoon on any working day in the Third Reich, the possibility of denunciation hovered over every conversation. Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan defined the natural state of man as a war of all against all. What made the situation in the Third Reich resemble that description was the constant possibility of being denounced, and the equivalent possibility for any citizen of denouncing another. The system of denunciations was both spontaneous and institutional. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, announced in April 1934 that every comrade of the party and every citizen, driven by honest interest in the movement and the nation, can approach the Führer or me without fear. The avalanche of denunciations that followed was such that within a few months, Hess had to ask informers to abandon their anonymity. The number of unproven accusations that went through the courts in 1934 was double that of 1933. The motivations were as varied as human situations: personal resentments, workplace envy, neighborhood disputes, greed, fear, genuine ideology, or simply the opportunity to settle a score. In Nuremberg, a Nazi newspaper published in November 1934 that it was in possession of an erotic diary belonging to a Jew named Erlanger with the names of 25 alleged lovers, publishing the first 4 with names, addresses, and occupations. The crowd gathered outside the denounced person's house was described in the following article with satisfaction. The newspaper eventually partially backtracked, but the social damage, the public exposure, had already been done. A butcher who had offered to pay above the official price for a pig was denounced by the very farmer to whom he had made the offer when the negotiations failed. In court, the accused revealed the initial offer made by the informer. Both were sentenced to prison terms. 2 strangers began drinking together in a tavern in a Bavarian village at the start of the war. One got drunk. When he sobered up, the other informed him that while he was under the influence of alcohol, he had expressed views contrary to the regime, and that a party member sitting at the next table would likely report him. 48 hours later, the frightened drinker received a letter requesting the payment of 60 marks for the benefit of the Red Cross. He paid. New requests arrived. Finally, when he was already at the front, his wife denounced the case, and the extortionist, who had accumulated 350 marks, was discovered, tried, and executed. Women played a disproportionate role in denunciations, especially during the war when their husbands were at the front and they were considered, according to official rhetoric, guardians of the German home. There were women capable of informing the Gestapo that someone had given a piece of bread to a starving Russian prisoner. There were women who threatened to report tenants who preferred not to go down to air raid shelters so that in case they died, no compensation would be paid to their relatives. The Gestapo, the secret state police under the command of Heinrich Himmler and the operational direction of Reinhard Heydrich until his assassination in May 1942, was not the omnipresent apparatus often imagined in movies. In 1937, the Gestapo across Germany had about 7,000 full-time agents for a population of 60 million people. Its effectiveness did not rely on omniscience, but on voluntary denunciation. The average citizen was, in many cases, the best agent of the Gestapo. In practice, the Gestapo tortured. The Ministry of Justice acknowledged in 1937 that during intensive interrogation, beatings were permitted as long as they did not exceed 25 and were restricted to the back of the body. After the 10th blow, the presence of a doctor was required, and a single type of baton was chosen for the entire country to avoid the arbitrary application of these rules. Terror had its own bureaucracy. While the day of the Aryan citizens of the Reich passed between work, radio, and the latent possibility of denunciation, for another category of people, every evening was a negotiation with survival. The German Jews, approximately 500,000 in 1933, 0.75% of the total population. More than 80% had been in Germany for generations. They had served in the Great War. The famous 1916 military census, commissioned by the Prussian Ministry of War in response to accusations of draft evasion, had shown that German Jews contributed disproportionately more than their numbers would suggest, a fact that was never officially published. The German anti-Semitism of the years prior to 1933 was neither universal nor uniform. Before World War I, Jews had been subject to legal restrictions that were gradually removed with the unification of 1871. Many Jews from Eastern Europe had emigrated to Germany precisely because the persecution they faced in Russia or Poland was comparatively less severe there. In the Weimar Republic, Jews had access to the liberal professions, academia, theatre, banking, and journalism in proportions that exceeded their demographic weight, a direct consequence of the old restrictions that had kept them away from land ownership and channeled them into urban sectors. And that, in the Nazi narrative, was proof of their conspiracy. On April 1, 1933, the NSDAP organized the first systematic boycott of Jewish businesses. Members of the SA stood in front of stores, doctors' and lawyers' offices and pharmacies, with signs warning Aryan passers-by not to enter. The operation was semi-public, controversial even within the movement, and was partially abandoned after a few hours because the public response was colder than expected. But it marked a turning point. The Nuremberg Laws, enacted on September 15, 1935, during the party's annual Congress, were the definitive threshold. Two separate laws, the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. The first deprived Jews of German citizenship, reducing them to subjects of the state. The second prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and citizens of German or related blood. Racial corruption became a criminal offense. Nazi courts prosecuted cases of racial corruption even when sexual intercourse had not been proven, if proximate actions such as caressing could be alleged. When it was established that the accused had had full sexual relations, the death sentence could replace the prescribed 10-year sentence. And in practice, the Gestapo systematically transferred convicted Jews to concentration camps as a supplement or substitute for their prison sentence. The Aryanization of businesses proceeded in parallel. In Berlin, of the 3,750 stores still owned by Jews at the time of Kristallnacht, only 700 were transferred to other hands within the small German bourgeoisie. The big beneficiaries were not the artisans and shopkeepers that the regime promised to emancipate. They were the large industrial conglomerates. Mannesmann, Flick, Otto Wolff, and the Hermann Göring industries absorbed the most valuable Jewish properties. The dream of the small merchant who took over a business from a Jew to rise up was, in most cases, a dream that never materialized. Kristallnacht, from November 9th to 10th, 1938, was the visible point of no return. On the night of November 9th to 10th, more than 7,500 Jewish businesses were destroyed and looted. More than 1,400 synagogues were set on fire or severely damaged. It is estimated that 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to the camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. At least 91 people were killed during the pogrom, although the real numbers were probably higher. The non-Jewish citizens living next to the synagogues that were burning and the smashed shop windows had diverse reactions. Some expressed genuine disgust. Grunberger documents that the atavistic spectacle of the burning synagogues could not fail to awaken reactions of consternation in many Germans. But the distance between private disgust and public resistance was a gap that almost no one crossed. A citizen who regularly visited Jewish friends in Berlin arrived one day to find the door of the apartment sealed. The janitor's wife whispered what had happened and begged him, "Leave quickly, because if someone hears us, they will report us to the Gestapo." By the end of 1938, signs saying "No dogs or Jews allowed" had proliferated in parks, restaurants, swimming pools, and park benches throughout the Reich. The yellow stars, which became mandatory in 1941, were not yet visible in 1938, but social segregation was already fully visible. A 1943 report from a provincial judge sent to the Ministry of Justice reflected on what had happened 5 years earlier. What has become of the properties of the Jews? Their assets would be enough to cover the needs of all those evacuated from the bombed areas. The question was rhetorical. Everyone knew the answer. But framing it as a matter of distributive justice, not moral horror, was exactly the type of rationalization that allowed the majority to keep sleeping at night. The Dachau concentration camp was opened on March 22, 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power. Its first prisoners were not Jews. They were communists, social democrats, journalists, intellectuals, Protestant pastors, Catholic priests, the enemies of the state whose mere existence the regime considered incompatible with the new order. The existence of the camps was an open secret. The first camps of the 1920s, used during the revolutionary crisis period of 1919 to 1923 by various factions, had prepared the mental ground for the idea that certain anti-social elements could be confined without formal judicial process. Nazi propaganda had cultivated this notion for years before coming to power. When the camps became a reality, most German citizens decided not to ask too many questions. It wasn't always fear. More often, it was a kind of tacit agreement not to know what they didn't want to know. Grunberger documented that the concentration camps and the yellow stars were part of the natural order of things for a significant segment of the population after the first few years. For the prisoners of the camps, however, the reality was one of calculated brutality. The regime's method for reducing prisoners, as documented by testimonies from the Dachau camp, was to literally turn them into numbers. The inmates lost their names, their possessions, their clothes. They slept in overcrowded barracks. Forced labor was organized to destroy without immediately killing, a pedagogy of humiliation aimed at the collapse of individual identity before physical death. The re-education camps, the euphemism used in the early years, had been preceded in German political discourse by similar references that the public had heard in the previous decades without causing particular alarm. The novelty of the Nazi system was not inventing the idea of the camp, it was turning it into a systematic instrument of state terror with the weight of legality and bureaucracy behind every order. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS since 1929, was the architect of the system. Born in Munich in 1900, raised in a middle-class Catholic family and a student of agriculture, he had found his calling in the Nazi Party at the age of 22. He was methodical, cold, and ideologically disciplined to a degree that even Hitler sometimes found extreme. He kept his wife in a small property in Bavaria while living in Berlin with his secretary, an arrangement he claimed was motivated by eugenic reasons. His wife had only given him a daughter. Himmler himself accompanied members of the Freundeskreis Heinrich Himmler, an organization formed by industrialists, bankers, and figures from big capital who financed the SS, on a visit to the Dachau concentration camp in 1937. The visit was part of the services the SS provided to its sponsors. It allowed them to see what they were doing. 5 years later, in 1942, Ohlendorf, the head of the SS Secret Service, would give them a lecture on the operations of the 4 extermination brigades responsible for the death of more than 1 million Jews in Eastern Europe. Industry knew, banking knew, the diplomatic corps knew, officials from the Ministry of Justice knew. At the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, 11 secretaries or undersecretaries from various ministries, Foreign Affairs, the Interior, Economics, Transport, Eastern Territories, signed the documents coordinating the final solution to the Jewish question. The euphemism was part of the regular bureaucratic language. What they signed was the plan for the systematic extermination of all Jews in Europe. In 1944, Krupp housed 70,000 non-German workers in 57 prison camps in the Essen area, 2,000 of whom were Hungarian Jews rented by Pfister, the commander of Buchenwald, at the price of 4 marks per day. The company spent 70 pfennigs per day on the food for each Jew. It also paid for barbed wire, watchtowers and floodlights. That was the Third Reich at 4 in the afternoon, an open business. The year of the Reich had a rhythm different from the Christian year, parallel to it, sometimes overlapping, sometimes in open competition. The Nazi calendar was structured like a liturgical cycle that infused the mundane routine with edifying moments. January 30th was Day of the Seizure of Power. February 24th, the anniversary of the founding of the party. April 20th, Hitler's birthday, celebrated with pictures of the Führer in golden frames surrounded by garlands in shop windows and facades wrapped in red flags with the black swastika on a white circle. May 1st, renamed National Labor Day. The summer solstice with nighttime bonfires and couples jumping over flames to the sound of gongs. November 9th, the anniversary of the failed 1923 coup, the most sacred party holiday. And in September, Nuremberg. The party's annual rally in Nuremberg was the central event of the Nazi ritual year. For a week, between 100,000 and 700,000 people, depending on the year, would converge on the city of the master singers to take part in the most elaborate mass spectacle in modern history. Albert Speer, the architect of the facilities and designer of the Cathedral of Light, the 130 anti-aircraft floodlights pointing to the night sky that created the illusion of luminous columns, described the effect as something that surpassed any architectural construction. The British ambassador himself, Sir Neville Henderson, acknowledged that the spectacle was all the more mesmerizing the more dangerous it was. In Nuremberg, parodies of Christian worship alternated with displays of military strength. There were processions of banners, speeches in stadiums with acoustics designed to amplify the voice to make it sound supernatural. The blood banner, the standard that was supposedly stained with the blood of those fallen in the 1923 coup, was carried in procession and touched with new flags to consecrate them. It was literally a parody of the Corpus Christi rite. Grunberger described Nazism as a Catholicism without Christianity. The fundamental organizational principle of the pseudo-religion of Nazism was the masking of its total lack of transcendence through ever-increasing doses of ritual. In 1937, a new housing development in Braunschweig-Lehndorf included a Protestant church without a tower. The tower of the building that would oversee the complex was to be that of the Aufbauhaus, the local headquarters of the party. The party wanted to be the church, and in many areas of daily life it succeeded. Wedding and funeral ceremonies were gradually colonized. The registration of births had its Nazi equivalent in the party's baptisms. Pagan festivals of the solstice tried to replace Christmas. With all its limitations and failures, the SS's religious policy, promoted by Himmler, who had a fascinating yet eccentric interest in Germanic mythology and runes, sought to create a new religiosity based on blood, soil, and race. Nazism, according to historian Eric Voegelin, whose book Race and State was confiscated by the Gestapo immediately after its publication in 1933, and whose family was harassed in their home until they emigrated, was not simply uncontrolled science or distorted Christianity. It was something more disturbing, a political gnosis, a promise of salvation in the here and now, founded on the certainty of possessing the truth about the biological nature of man and the fate of the races. For the ordinary citizen attending the rituals of the party, neighborhood rallies, winter aid collections, the one-pot days when the whole nation had to eat the same to demonstrate the community of the people, these rituals were, depending on the individual, moments of genuine faith, social conformity, or simple exhaustion in the face of the impossibility of resistance. The local leader of the German Labour Front at a factory in Württemberg arranged for 2 workers to entertain each morning with songs played on the harmonica as the opening of the day's tasks. It was a miniature religious celebration, daily. The afternoon in the home of a German woman in the Third Reich was a terrain of contradictions that the regime never fully resolved. The official program was clear: women were to be mothers. The formula Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, was not new, but Nazism elevated it to a political dogma. Honor crosses were awarded to the most prolific mothers, bronze for 4 or more children, silver for 6, gold for 8 or more. In the public ceremonies of Father's Day on the second Sunday of May, fertility was explicitly rewarded as a national virtue. Women employed in public administration were progressively displaced from their positions in the early years of the regime. They were encouraged to leave paid employment through loans to newlywed couples conditioned on the bride leaving her job. The loan was 1,000 marks, a substantial sum, and for each child born, a quarter of the debt was forgiven. In practice, however, the war economy and rearmament created a demand for labor that made the policy of excluding women from the labor market unsustainable. By the late 1930s, the proportion of women in industrial work was increasing at a speed that the regime tried to justify ideologically without abandoning its maternal rhetoric. By 1944, the armaments factories employed millions of women, in addition to 7.5 million foreign workers under forced labor conditions. The wives of Nazi leaders occupied a peculiar and paradoxical position in the Reich. The society of the Third Reich was so male-centric that women barely appeared in public. Emmy Goering, former actress and wife of Hitler's presumed heir, was the most visible figure, but even she never performed the social functions that would have corresponded to a conventional First Lady. She did not visit schools, nor did she regularly preside over charity events. The wives of the party's middle-ranking officials led lives marked by the system's demands on their husbands. A civil servant could be expelled from his post if his wife's behavior was in any way unbefitting the wife of a state employee. The wives of officials were under pressure to participate in party activities, shop in Aryan stores, and report suspicious behavior in their neighborhoods. Grunberger documented the existence of what we could call the Society of Female Surveillance, women evacuated from Berlin who spy on each other incessantly. Denunciation among neighbors, especially during the war, was an extension of the domestic role turned into a political instrument. Who usually brings the majority of charges of felony and high treason? The women whose husbands are at the front or have been killed in action, acknowledged a Nazi newspaper with a mix of approval and perplexity. The women's section of the party had its own ambitions. In many schools and female boarding schools of secondary education, female students adopted poor children as a form of social work. The wives of teachers and other middle-class women were encouraged to do social work to assist large families. The sarcastic phrase that circulated successfully in the hallways was, "The teacher's wife is cleaning the children's bottoms." The female body was also, explicitly, a state resource. The Ministry of the Interior's memoranda on childless civil servants, the deadlines that the Gauleiter set for their officials to marry, the decrees that required written statements on the absence of children, all pointed to the same logic. The womb of every German woman was a national asset, and the state had the right to inquire why it wasn't producing. That afternoon at home, while the broth simmered on the cook stove and the radio broadcast the news bulletin, the woman of the Reich was simultaneously the guardian of the home and a link in the regime's surveillance and biological production machinery. At 9 in the evening, in the party's venues, in the historic beer halls of Munich, in the SA clubs, the Reich had a different face. The annual commemorations of the failed beer hall putsch of November 8th and 9th, 1923, were, in Grunberger's words, the biggest collective drunken binges of each year, both in times of peace and during the war. The old fighters, the Unterkämpfer of the movement, gathered in the same beer halls where Hitler had attempted and failed in his coup, drinking and reminiscing. It was a ritual of camaraderie that mixed nostalgia, pride, and alcohol in varying proportions. Alcoholism was the party's vice par excellence. Christian Weber, a former taxi driver turned owner of a fleet of buses, a network of gas stations, and one of the best horse-breeding farms in Germany, as well as district president and superintendent of forestry in Upper Bavaria, was frequently found unconscious in a Munich street gutter in the mornings. No one denounced him. He was one of their own. The Minister of Economy, Walter Funk, was a notorious and public drunkard. Victor Lutzer, Rome's successor at the head of the SA, whose death in a car accident during the war was popularly attributed to driving under the influence of alcohol. Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front and preacher of moderation, was identified in his public memoirs as someone whose control over his own subconscious was questionable. When he launched a health preservation through abstinence campaign in 1939, he began with the slogan, "Moderation is not enough," and had to hastily add, "We must be radical even in abstinence." Hitler's photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, was generally known as the chief national drunkard, Reichstrunkenbold. At the fraternity dinners attended by officials, the meetings sometimes ended with rifle shooting contests where light bulbs and pictures were used as targets. At the wedding of Gauleiter Terboven in Essen in June 1934, 20,000 torches lit the night sky, and fireworks turned the event into a Renaissance-style spectacle. Hitler was present to give a mythical meaning to the ceremony. The next morning, he took a plane south to oversee the massacre of the SA leadership in what history knows as the Night of the Long Knives. The repressive plan had been devised during the wedding celebration itself. At times, the dissipation of the party led to literal consequences. At a commemoration during the war of the first party meeting in Coburg, one of the participants, drunk to the point of unconsciousness, killed himself by falling out of a second-floor window of the hotel. The social life of the top leaders combined the most extravagant opulence with a vulgarity that baffled even those around them. The 1936 opera ball, organized by Goering, cost no less than 1 million marks. A few weeks later, Goebbels organized a nighttime festival on Peacock Island on the outskirts of Berlin, with Wehrmacht pontoons to access the island, young pages in tight white trousers and satin blouses carrying torches. The old fighters of the party who accompanied Goebbels were so out of place in the Rococo setting that they threw themselves at the pages and dragged them into the underbrush. Tables were overturned, torches were extinguished, and in the confusion, several of the militants had to be rescued from the waters. This was the elite of the Reich. Men of provincial origin and low education who had accumulated power, wealth confiscated from others, uniforms and titles. Men who, in Grunberger's words, constantly oscillated between envy of their social superiors, the tendency toward the deferential gesture of the parvenu, and emulation before hierarchical figures. At midnight, in the darkest years of the Reich, the system was sustained by pillars that had been corroding from the inside. The war changed everything. The average work week for men increased from 49 hours in 1939 to 52 in 1943 and reached 72 in key industries like aircraft production in the final years of the conflict. Women worked 56 hours in factories. Bank employees worked 53. Rationing began in September 1939 with initially mild measures. The regime wanted to popularize the war, but it grew harsher with each defeat. In 1942, the meat ration for the average consumer was reduced to 300 grams per week. In 1943, it dropped to 250 grams. Bread was rationed. Sugar was rationed. Butter, which had been informally rationed since the winter of 1936 to 37, was now officially distributed through ration cards. The black market became an integral part of daily life. Farmers exchanged eggs for cigarettes, 1 for 1, pounds of butter for pipe tobacco, and pounds of meat for 10 cigarettes. In cities, cafes served alcohol in coffee cups to evade rationing. The price of coffee on the black market reached 40 marks per kilo during the occupation. During the last winter of the war, a pound of coffee was equivalent to the price of 20 liters of gasoline. The Allied air raids brought the horror of war to the heart of the Reich. On a single day in the fall of 1944, cities in the Ruhr suffered attacks that turned entire neighborhoods into smoking rubble. The civilian evacuation plan, the Kinderlandverschickung, which relocated children from cities to the countryside, separated entire families for months or years, breaking the family fabric that the regime had sought to sanctify. In the receiving villages, the tension was palpable. Women evacuated from the Rhineland cities were called the whores of the bombs by the local inhabitants, in a demonstration that the community spirit of the people had its limits exactly where the specific interests of each community began. Denunciation continued. In Constance, by Lake Constance at the end of April 1945, when the Allied advance was already forcing local Gestapo authorities into a hasty retreat to the Alpine redoubt, the inhabitants continued to report each other. A Viennese man who had expressed skepticism about the Endsieg, The final victory, in a letter to a friend, was denounced, prosecuted, and executed. A married couple was executed for advising their son to develop a bladder condition to avoid being sent to the front. 2 teenagers who stole from a soldier's house were executed. A female worker who stole 5 towels, a sheet, and a cushion from an army warehouse was executed. The annual total of executions in Germany quintupled between 1940 and 1943, from 926 to 5,336. In the bunkers of Berlin, the system that had promised redemption and greatness was reduced to execution procedures. SS troops executed deserters in the final days of the conflict, when the Soviet vanguards were already just a few kilometers from the Reich Chancellery. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. Until the end, Goebbels, who had stayed with him until the last day, wrote in his diary, "During these 12 years of easy living, most of the party fighters had dissolved in alcohol the small amount of grey matter that once led them to join the movement." The building collapsed, and with it the pretense that it had ever been anything other than what it was. We've walked through a day, from the dawn when the alarm clock rang in apartments smelling of coal to the midnight of collapse. From the worker who was grateful to have a job to the Jew who negotiated his survival hour by hour. From the block leader who wrote down the suspicious behaviors of the neighbor on the 3rd floor to the Gauleiter who presided over his provincial fief with the manners of a second-rate feudal lord. What makes this journey disturbing is not the exceptional monstrosity of the Nazi regime, it is its operational normality, the fact that it operated through recognizable mechanisms: bureaucracy, institutional loyalty, economic incentives, social fear, community rituals, aspirations for promotion, accumulated resentment against those who had more. What Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil had a concrete corollary in every workday, in every factory canteen, in every neighborhood meeting where winter aid passed the tray. Lawrence Rees, in his work Inside the Nazi Mind, 12 Lessons from History, published in 2025, documented precisely how the Nazis did not create the conspiracy theories they used, but rather inherited them from a previous cultural crisis and amplified them to the point of madness. Latent anti-Semitism, the stab in the back, the faith in the redemptive leader, none of these ideas were new in 1933. All of them had history, and all of them, under the conditions of economic crisis, recent military defeat, and national humiliation, found the fuel they needed. Richard Grunberger demonstrated in his social history of the Third Reich that Nazism was not only terror, it was also tourism organization, the construction of workers' housing, child vaccination campaigns, and cruises to the fjords. The regime sold itself as an alternative modernity, and for millions of people who had known the misery of the Depression, it seemed to fulfill its promise during the early years. That is precisely the most lasting warning, not the unmistakable monster that is easy to reject, but the system that bears too much resemblance to many other things we know: propaganda that calls for conspiracies, the cult of the leader who promises salvation, the conversion of the foreigner into a scapegoat, the gradual emptying of legal institutions while maintaining their appearance, the privatization of cruelty through denunciations between neighbors. These forms do not require brown shirts or swastikas to reproduce. A day in the Third Reich ended as it had begun, with the mandatory salute, with the fear of being overheard, with the poisoned gratitude of someone who has work but has lost their rights, with the certainty that somewhere there were camps whose existence was better not to ask about. The day ended, and the next day it began again.